This is the fourth in a series of videos retracing the life of Mary Rabagliati. Joining Joseph Wresinski, she became one of the most influential people helping him shape ATD Fourth World as a worldwide movement to overcome poverty. This video is about her experience on the front lines of the US war on poverty in 1965 and 66.
Father Joseph Wresinski asked me to go to the United States for a year to develop our understanding of how to make a difference. Extreme poverty doesn't change overnight. It was to look for big answers that Wresinski asked me to spend a year working for Mobilization for Youth, an anti-poverty organisation on the Lower East Side of New York. The goal was to learn how they understood poverty and tried to fight it. In New York, I lived in a very poor neighbourhood, full of life with a mixture of Jewish, black and Puerto Rican people. There was a lot of violence and drug addiction. Some people were passed out on the pavement. Police brutality was rampant. Once that year, 10 police officers beat up some Puerto Rican girls on our block. There were hippies too, living on that street. You would always hear someone's music. In my first 4 months, my flat was broken into twice. First, someone took my typewriter, radio and electric fan. The second time, they left me with nothing, no clothes and no food. So I put up bars on the window to the fire escape. I felt I was in a cage, but it was freedom or safety. It was hard, but you can't just curl up in a corner. The civil rights movement was going strong. People in poverty were brought together to speak out or to demonstrate. At Mobilization for Youth, I asked questions to learn as much as possible. Candido de Leon advised that they begin applying the scientific model used in industry at the time. Plan each step, execute it, and then measure how close you came to your target.
Mary particularly appreciated meeting Candido de Leon, who directed MFY's higher education program designed to prevent so-called juvenile delinquency. De Leon said, "I had graduate students tutor the young people. I emphasized that those of us working in the program had to stop discovering that poor people can learn. It was our obligation to teach them how to learn, to let them discover for themselves that they could learn."
The war on poverty began with high hopes of ending poverty in 5 years, but Americans are impatient. If your project doesn't show results quickly, it will be shut down. If a funding stream changes, everyone switches jobs. This happened to Mobilization for Youth. A few months after I left, MFY lost its grants and shut down all the activities. During my year with MFY, I volunteered with the Medical Committee for Human Rights. When MFY gave me a vacation, the Medical Committee sent me to Selma, Alabama. This committee was first organised to provide healthcare to volunteers for the Freedom Summer campaign who registered black voters in Mississippi. Registering voters was quite dangerous. Every day, volunteers risked being beaten, thrown in jail or even murdered. As this was the year following Freedom Summer, the committee also began supporting black people to register official complaints about racial discrimination in public hospitals. I was asked to surreptitiously investigate hospital conditions.
As a British woman, Mary had a hard time sneaking around an Alabama hospital without attracting attention. She was quickly arrested.
Fortunately for me, after only a few hours, I was rescued from jail by a civil rights champion, Donald Jelinek of the American Civil Liberties Union. This experience showed me that challenging issues required long-term commitments, not just handfuls of individuals popping in for only 2 weeks at a time. By commitment, I mean keeping it year after year and being prepared to really give something of oneself.
A year after Mary's arrival in the United States, Wresinski joined her. Together they visited anti-poverty programs around the country in order to draw ideas that would shape ATD Fourth World.
In each place, poverty looked quite different. But everywhere Wresinski had the same question: what happens to people who are left out? Many leaders just didn't make time to listen to the poorest people. They said, those families are too lazy to come to our meetings, as though there were no other obstacles. In fact, people who spoke in the name of the poor on television kept on saying, not all of us are unemployed or on welfare. They knew that society wanted to help only the poor who were seen as sober and serious. Our first stop was Washington, D.C., where national programs were run. Dick Boone was one of the most impressive people we met there. His childhood in a struggling community of Appalachia convinced him that people in poverty should be true partners in designing solutions. He objected to the fight for a bigger and better welfare state, where it is accepted that people would receive material support, but would not be needed to contribute to society. The price to pay for welfare is an increase in control by society over the personal lives of families in poverty, dictating a way of life and cancelling out personal freedom of choice. Living on welfare benefits turns people into second-class citizens. Wresinski agreed and wanted to know if community development projects aimed more broadly to open people's perspectives on life. His question was how all people could have a sense of beauty, grandeur, and being part of something larger than their own struggle. In Jackson, Mississippi, we were struck by a contradiction in community organising. The organisers genuinely wanted to offer people in poverty the chance to propose and lead projects, and at the same time, the community organisers had already decided it would be dangerous for the poor to become too political, which would jeopardise future project funding. Another sad situation we saw in Jackson was a children's development project that was considered successfully completed. And therefore, all its national funding had just been cut off. Every single book, toy and music record had been taken back by Washington. Many of the staff were determined to carry on somehow on a voluntary basis, but they had also lost their offices. I wish the cutting off of funds had caused a real revolution among people who tasted the cookie and were not prepared to let it go. However, one of the biggest dangers in fighting poverty is that people are quieted down by repeated crumbs and become too easily satisfied. A year earlier, riots had taken place in Watts, California, that led the government to add more funding for programs in poor neighborhoods in the summer to prevent other riots. But the funds are only crumbs for the summer. Come autumn, nothing more is done. In Nashville, Tennessee, at the Southern Student Organizing Committee, we saw big differences among white civil rights activists, depending on whether they were visiting from the North or had grown up in the South. Those from the North had the full support of their communities and were celebrated, but a white student from the South who made common cause with blacks was seen as betraying his family. So to Southern students, the most important actions were less about changing laws and more about changing minds to convince other white Southerners that segregation is unjust. Next, we went to New Orleans. At the Desire Housing Project, 19,000 black people live in nasty housing conditions that give the appearance and feeling of a concentration camp. A New Orleans bishop invited us to speak at the Catholic Charities Conference, despite the fact that I'm not Catholic and that ATD is not a religious organisation. However, most conference goers were bourgeois, well-fed clergy, caught up in the rat race of making their programs conform to Washington's politics, rather than using their own heads. Wresinski had been invited to address them, But since he didn't speak English, I read a translation of his speech. I was quaking at the knees because that was the first time I ever spoke in public. We were quite disappointed because the only questions asked were about how our work is funded and how much we are paid. Turning west, we saw miles of fantastic unearthly country. This land has an intensity that no outsider can penetrate. The people there were in very close contact with the land. On a dirt road in New Mexico, we had the impression that outsiders do not understand the Indian way of life. Indians seem to be neglected from every point of view, including by the civil rights movement. Our destination in the west of Delano, California, where we met Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. They were running a strike with Mexican and Filipino grapefield labourers. The camps where the workers live during the growing season are inhuman. One man told us that his contractor pays him in alcohol instead of money. I joined their picket line, while Wresinski leapt about in the grapevines, taking photographs and making everyone frightened that he would be arrested or worse. During our visit, an employee at a packing factory deliberately used a truck to run down one of the men picketing the factory. This employee was not a truck driver. He used the truck to frighten away the picket line. But instead, his action sparked a larger demonstration. I felt as though I was in the middle of a miniature revolution led by the labour union. From there, we went north to a Black Power conference at Berkeley. The audience was mostly white and seemed to forget that they were a part of the dominating white majority. I think organisations as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee are quite right to push their white members to go out and organise poor whites. Many people, both black and white, said to us how extremely difficult it is to go into a poor white community to talk about the civil rights of black people. But nothing will change unless this is done. After turning back east in St. Louis, Missouri, we stumbled on the most awful and miserable area that I have ever seen anywhere. Just a few blocks away from a spacious, well-groomed avenue was a large black neighbourhood where the residents' main occupation seemed to be collecting old junk and rags. I didn't see a single store, and there was a distinct feeling that no one in St. Louis cared a damn about this neighbourhood. In the nicer part of the city, well-dressed white people were going about their business with confidence. We also saw two young black men there, their clothes untidy and the wrong size. They had a look of bewilderment, as if they were from another land. Next, we went to Kentucky. In Appalachia, one again feels remote from the great America that presents itself to the world. It's not like the Deep South or a deprived urban neighbourhood where people live next door to affluence and suffer from direct segregation. Anti-poverty programs have great difficulty making a mark because the roots of a particular way of life go very deep for the people in the heart of the Mountain District. Eastern Kentucky is beautiful, with winding roads among the mountains, but it is extremely poor. Years of coal dust have left a layer of permanent grime on everything. Unemployment is enormous, and one doctor said, the state of health here is what you find in developing countries: malnutrition, anemia, and illness due to poor hygiene. In Berea, Kentucky, we met staff from the Council of the Southern Mountains. I appreciated that they were always trying to deepen their understanding of people's situations. Unlike most other groups we visited, they didn't announce that they already knew the solutions to poverty. They were quite humbly searching for new approaches. Our last port of call was Chicago, where the Commission on Youth Welfare was trying to improve relationships between the police and young people who are either in gangs or liable to be influenced by them. I hope that some good is being done there, but a cop is always a cop, and they seem to walk on sensitive ground wearing hobnailed boots. The police see no reason for youths to band together, and so they put their heads down and try to break up everything they can lay their hands on. Not very successfully as far as we could see. One day, we found ourselves in the middle of a small battle between two gangs with guns blazing. This pushed Wresinski to think about new ways that ATD Fourth World could respond to the needs of young people. Across the country, programs were being directed at a mass of poor people, but without any real understanding of the different levels of poverty. Many people in poverty do arrive at a better state, while there are still some unreached. This happened in France. The families in the Noisy-le-Grand emergency housing camp are despised by those of a slightly higher level who say, now that the welfare state is helping you, it's your own fault if you're still poor. Another thing that struck us as we travelled was how completely segregated vast neighbourhoods were. Some communities were entirely Puerto Rican, while others were entirely black. In Chicago, we visited a huge Polish district and an Italian one. You don't see that in France because of policies to integrate housing. Immigrants of similar backgrounds are scattered as much as possible to prevent a Portuguese neighbourhood here and a Jewish neighbourhood there. For people in America, segregation is terrible. No matter where we went, even when there were many poor areas, the very worst places were always in the black neighbourhoods. Terribly run-down housing with nowhere safe for children to play. That's what we saw in St. Louis. Segregation is a travesty of justice. Despite this, we also saw that for many people, being part of their own ethnic communities also brings a source of extraordinary vitality. It created a more optimistic and dynamic sense of community than in poor communities in France. One black woman in Marion, Alabama, told us, "We blacks are in a constant state of worry. We might rejoice and feel hopeful one day, but by the next day, it's quiet despair again. We're afraid to change anything because we know that every time things go wrong, it's always our blood that gets spilled. But in the end, maybe our blood is the price we have to pay for things to change." Her despair was palpable, but so was her belief that change must somehow be possible, someday. I think that ATD Fourth World needs to work in a variety of contexts. In low-income communities in Europe, we started putting down roots and building a long-term commitment. While in America, we saw that we could connect with others who weren't afraid of trying something new. Our journey ended back in New York with a meeting to launch a US branch of ATD Fourth World. Another ATD volunteer began developing our work there, while I returned with Wresinski to Europe, where we were determined to make our work more political. Others in society still did not understand that our motivations were not sentimental or purely moral. We needed a way to show that people in poverty should not be seen as passive recipients of aid. Our goal was not to show that the poor should be loved. Rather, it was to show that people in extreme poverty have been excluded from humanity. We were already certain that this was the crucial issue. However, our time in the United States gave us the idea of starting community meetings. We began to sharpen our understanding of poverty by making sure that people in a community would identify their own needs. We also began planning and evaluating every project we did. Wresinski was very struck by the loose nature of the civil rights movement. We were touched when one woman said, "Oh, you're part of the civil rights movement, just like us." We did feel that we worked in the same spirit of ensuring that no one's rights would ever be denied. We had begun calling ATD Fourth World a movement too, but the civil rights movement also seemed to us so very unstructured that it struggled to be effective. It was very fragmented and lacked a big picture, and there was no strategy to prevent the most dynamic leaders in a poor community from always moving on to new jobs as soon as funding ended. So while we considered ATD a movement, we also talked about the need to build our own long-term institutions, for research, for action, and for our volunteer corps, which gave priority to looking for people who were left behind by dynamic programs. But we remained driven by the same spirit as all the civil rights activists we met, a thirst for justice, truth, equality, and brotherhood.
This has been the fourth video in the series Fighting for the Hope of Dignity, drawing Mary Rabagliati's life.